He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another weekly episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and today we're going to explore another type of hairy bipedal creature called the Mapinguari. However, before we get into that, a couple of plugs. You can find us on our website at CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. Additionally, we're also on Patreon, where you can get ad-free early episodes available there. And should you wish to reach us directly, you can via our email at cryptidclues@gmail.com. So, without further ado, let's investigate. The Mapinguari. This creature resides in the rainforest of Brazil, also known as the Juma. Its overall appearance tends to vary depending on who's explaining it. But for certain, this entity is a quadrubipedal humanoid and in most accounts stands 7 feet tall when it's on its hind two legs. Now, when it's standing in that position, it is a little bit rocky and a little clumsy at times, as reported. The Sasquatch notion comes into play here, however, because reports also claim that it is like a giant bear with a monkey's face. Additionally, it emits a horrible smell. Now, I'm not personally trying to implicate that this is a Sasquatch, as it's got its very own rich history in Brazilian folklore, but I do find it interesting how the terrible smell is associated so closely with a variety of other popular cryptids out there. I digress, though. This smell is speculated to be from its second mouth in its belly. Yes, that is right. If you source some pictures, you can actually see that it has this terrifying stomach mouth in its lower belly area. Additionally, it has long matted fur. It outputs these blood-curdling howls along with one singular eye on its head. That's more so in the legend folklore part. The first-hand sightings tend to report that it has two. Now, when it comes to the actual evidence, it's a hard thing to kind of hone in on. And while science is limited in what it can tell us, it did yield research teams and a possible theory that these cryptid encounters were really with a giant sloth, which were bigger than elephants at this time and lived as close as 8,500 years ago. But, of course, they're all assumed to be extinct. Also, when I say science is limited in what it can tell us, and this is my own personal opinion, science is like yin, and spiritualism is yang. Spiritualism is not limited to walking in the bushes and soaking in the sunlight type of stuff, smelling the roses and everything. I mean in the religion, Mother Nature, interdimensional, all of that encompassed into one powerful yang, stacked with the powers of logic and science of yin. Holy smokes. Now that is a potent mix when you think about it. The sad thing is those two things are in a constant battle against each other. Mostly due to humans' own inner conflicts, but again, that's a conversation for another day. If we can combine these things together, I think we would find and discover a whole frontier of new things on our planet, in our solar system, in our universe, our way of being. Again, I'm not trying to go all enlightened here. That's just one of my perspectives. And in terms of this cryptid, I feel like we could really discover some interesting things. However, one of the most common tales about the Mapinguari is that an Amazonian shaman had learned the secret to immortality. This, of course, upset the gods, and once they had discovered this, they punished the shaman severely by turning him into this cryptid for the rest of existence as we know it. Now, it's said the only way to kill the Mapinguari is by shooting it in the head. However, this is also labeled impossible because most people that get too close to this thing get dizzy or disoriented. The odor, again, of this creature is so potent that people nearby often become incapacitated. And the cryptid also shows very vengeful tendencies, hunting those who disrespect the forest and its inhabitants. Now, Let's just examine these things here again. And I mean no disrespect, as this is my own comparison, but perhaps it's more so the similarities than me trying to implicate this as something like a Sasquatch. But these claims are strikingly similar. But ultimately, I'm more inclined to believe this could be a variant of sloth species, hidden away as well as the Sasquatch are. But on that note, when people encounter a Sasquatch, they often claim to get dizzy or disoriented, and this has caused speculation of infrasound. We know certain animals on this planet employ this ability, like rhinos, tigers, hippos, elephants, whales, squid, not to be confused with ultrasound, where the sound waves that are of a frequency greater than 20 kilohertz are just that, while sound waves of a frequency below 20 kilohertz are called infrasound. This is a sound wave we can't hear, but it is used as a form of communication amongst animals, and in some cases can cause humans to feel horrendous. I've mentioned this before on previous episodes with Reuben, and I'll just kind of give you a little bit of a reflection here. This is a speculation that Bigfoot and maybe other cryptids have the ability to use infrasound in this regard, like a tiger or other animals would. And the reported side effects of being exposed to infrasound include vertigo, imbalance, incapacitation, disorientation, nausea, vomiting, bowel spasms, sleep pattern disorders. So is the Mapinguari capable of using infrasound as well? I feel like there's a pretty interesting connection there. Again, that's my own take. People do claim to have killed these things. Now, if you shoot them in the head, that's what seals the deal. Now, keep in mind that this is something we'll touch upon later in this episode. There's also the odor, of course. I mean, eventually being out in the wilds, you're prone to getting dirty and grimy so badly that eventually it'll yield a rancid smell, I reckon. And of course, of my own curiosity, I wanted to know what the smell was specifically smelling like. I couldn't find much aside from it being more like a sewage scent. I was mostly curious if the common cryptid sulfur smell was present, but I couldn't find anything associating that smell with them, which is interesting in its own right, because then it kind of makes me think that this is more like a sloth, more like an animal creature that is still residing hidden in the forest. So where you have the Bigfoot and Dogman and maybe more of an interdimensional spiritual association attached to that. I digress. Speaking of being out in the wilds in the forests, let's quickly look into Brazil and a bit of the terrain. Now, you know me and you know what I love national parks. Brazil has at least 69 national parks. That is insane. The biggest one is the Amazonia National Park. This was established in 1974. It's been only expanding over the decades and covers an incredibly large range of 3,300 square miles. It hosts an immensely diverse ecosystem of flora and fauna. And the park sits more in the north central region of Brazil, halfway between the cities of Manaus and Belém. Now, Brazil itself is home to 60% of the Amazon rainforest, which accounts for approximately 1/10 of all species in the world. Brazil is also considered to have the greatest biodiversity of any country on the planet, containing over 70% of all animal and plant species cataloged. It has the most known plant species, sitting at around 55,000 to be exact, freshwater fish, 3,000, mammals, well over 689, and it comes in third place with the most bird species at about 1,832, second place with the most reptile species, 744. Brazil is the 5th largest country in the world and the 3rd largest in the Americas. So I think with all that being said, if you were wanting to hide, this is the place to do it. It would have no trouble in doing so, and with such a rich ecosystem to thrive in, many protected parks to hide in, and a diverse range of mountains, plains, and freshwater access, it's certainly ideal. So much so that Brazil actually has a confirmed 28 uncontacted tribes, with indications that another 86 could be left in the country, all uncontacted. That's more than any other country on the planet. It's very impressive. Now, we're obviously getting into a point of the developing world, and it's harder and harder for many animals and beings out there to kind of, I don't want to say hide, but live in their environments. And I think one of the biggest notions when it comes to Bigfoot, Dogman, cryptids, like the Mapinguari, is people would say, why haven't we seen them yet, or this or that? But when we're so exposed to just city life, like myself, we live out here in the city, you know, grocery stores down the street, and you can see mountains off in the distance and whatnot, and people are always driving around the mountains, and you think, okay, someone's going to find one of these things. Not necessarily. If you were to use satellite infrared thermal imagery and just shine it down in some of these forested areas, the chances of you actually spotting something is pretty slim, because there's just going to be such a diverse ecosystem, especially in the Amazon rainforest. Good Lord, it's going to be beaming up red on your thermal. You're not going to be able to see anything, let alone make out a giant being kind of like moving through the woods or anything like that. But that being said, when I mentioned how large these areas are of national parks or Brazil, it's just incredible, because when we're exposed to the city life, we're exposed to being in a small societal little bubble. Again, this is my take on it, but we often forget about how massive the world is. And in North America alone, North America is huge. We got big cities, of course, but the amount of empty forested space out there, I shouldn't say empty, it's packed with animals and rich ecosystems, but it's thriving, and we don't expose ourselves to that. So then we think that, oh, we are everywhere or all over the place, we should see these things. Now, when you look at Brazil, 60% of the Amazon rainforest, 70% of all animal and plant species cataloged. It's just incredible. There are so many places to hide, and we have to remember that while there's definitely billions and billions of human beings, and we have many, many cities and spreads all over the planet, there are still many uncontacted human pockets and many untouched areas of this world that harbor animals and plant life that have not been seen maybe since the existence of humanity, or have been seen but have forgotten. It goes on and on. That's its own rabbit hole, though, and I know I'm just rambling at this point, so we're going to get back on track after this quick ad break. And we're back. So getting back into the Mapinguari here, let's divert our attention to a Brazilian-based American biologist and ornithologist who has become prominently known for the theory that the Mapinguari is an extant species of ground sloth. Extant meaning still alive today. Professor David Oren received a bachelor's degree from Yale and a master's degree from Harvard back in the mid to late 70s. Most of his research has taken place directly in Brazil, but regarding his research, he initially didn't believe in this cryptid. Not until he began speaking more with the people who lived at the Tapajos River Basin that claimed to have sighted it. Now, like I mentioned before, Professor Oren at this time came to the conclusion that it has to be a ground sloth. He managed to collect over 100 accounts of this cryptid, and by 2002, he interviewed over 7 hunters that claimed to have fired shots at them. With 2 papers published back in 1993 and 2001 on this creature, he actually went and ventured out on a number of self-funded expeditions to the western Amazon area to look for the creature himself. While hair and waist samples were collected, they were identified as anteater and tapir affiliated. Now, that being said, things did get interesting in the 90s during a few more of his investigations, including finding and casting several unidentified footprints similar to that of ground sloths and unidentified animal sounds on multiple occasions. Now, sightings are still happening. Not so prominently today, but in the past few years, in the decade, but some of the first recorded ones go back as far as the early 1900s. It's just folklore kind of going way beyond that, but prior to Professor Oren inputting his ground sloth theory, a few cryptozoologists by the name of Bernard Heuvelmans and Ivan T. Sanderson proposed that the Mapinguari was actually a type of unidentified primate, similar to that of a Bigfoot. Getting into the types of tracks here, there were 2 types of tracks that were actually attributed to the Mapinguari. The first being an impression in the soil that was very much rounded, you could say. This is worth mentioning the bottlefoot cryptid of Brazil. It's another humanoid type of being that roams the forests. But moving on from that, we then have the other more common track that is sort of like a person's footprint, except backwards and has 4 toes. Professor Oren often described the Mapinguari's feces now as being just like a horse. Now, this claim is based on the only mammal in the Amazon to have feces that is extremely similar to a horse. Well, again, like I said earlier, there's many mammals out there, but the South American tapir has very similar waist to the horse, and there's one exception. They usually defecate in water. Where this waste is always found on land, usually where a Mapinguari is supposedly located. So is that to say a tapir is too proud to relieve themselves in the Amazon? No, there's a first for everything, but I certainly do appreciate these small pieces of evidence that can quite possibly help paint a bigger picture. And who would have thought something like that, where they usually would defecate in water, compared to like, hey, we found a bunch on land, and this feces looks like it's from a horse, but we know it's not horse. There's no horse here. There's no tapirs here. So we can kind of shift that theory and open up a door and create a bridge to this possible notion and conclusion. I love it. It's magic. It's pure magic. But I digress. Like a dog, man, most accounts of the Mapinguari claim that it can walk both bipedally and on all fours quadrupedally. This cryptid is also blamed for cattle being killed off among their herds. Now, from what I found, they do tend to eat a lot of vegetation, and there's not a lot of reports of them getting very violent towards, livestock and animals and eating all that kind of meat. But they are vengeful. So there's a fine line between that, maybe from an animal survival instinct, and then a vengeful, like knowing and harboring this vengeance towards seeing something disrespected towards like your forest, your home, those sorts of things. So one more thing that I thought was very fascinating was that these creatures are reportedly not alone. They're noticed and found to be together in groups, and when traveling, they're primarily in pairs. Now, as we near the half back portion of this episode, I got a few sightings and encounters I want to share with you guys. A few gold miners have encountered these things over the past few decades. One such instance, there was a man that claimed it was a giant monkey covered in reddish fur. It charged at him in the forest, where he shot at it in the face, but then all of a sudden he fainted. When he woke back up, the creature was gone, and he reported this off to Professor Oren. Now, the professor actually visited the site of the attack and found a pool of blood and raw paw prints with marks of clawed toes pointing inwards. Now, that is very sloth-like. Another sighting on the Tapajos River, a man was out hunting, and he was having a pretty successful day too, actually, when all of a sudden he started hearing unknown animal calls. He started to stress out. Immediately, he fled towards the river. When the vocalizations at this point began to get louder and closer, he hid under the water to the point where the calls became more muffled, and he could reaffirm himself, okay, the creature is now moving deeper into the forest. Sightings have also been reported on the Venezuelan border. There's one man that claimed to have come face to face with a Mapinguari when it actually had entered his remotely located cabin at night. It was so big that when it stood upright, making vocalizations at him, it pressed up against the ceiling. It had apparently swiped at the man, knocking him backwards. It hurt him, hurt his jaw too. He believed that he only survived due to his possession of a firearm, which he managed to discharge directly at the creature, having sent it running away, leaving some blood behind. We have another encounter where a woman was collecting fruit near her house when one of these creatures appeared. She immediately retreated back into her home. Now, this next one took place in 1930. An explorer by the name of Inocencio was venturing into the Urubu River. He had about 10 compatriots with him when they eventually got lost chasing after a group of monkeys they were intending to fire upon. Having become separated from his group, it eventually got dark, and he was forced to spend the night in a tree where he started to hear what sounded like a man that was crying out. And then that is when the creature appeared. And I quote, "Some 40 yards away was a small clearing where a Sama Morea had fallen, and its branches had brought down other smaller trees. This was where his last cry had come from. Immediately afterward, there was a loud noise of footsteps, as if a large animal was coming at me at top speed. When it reached the fallen tree, it gave a grunt and stopped. Finally, a silhouette the size of a man of middle height appeared in the clearing. It remained where it stood, looking perhaps suspiciously at the place where I was. Then it roared again as before. I could wait no longer and fired without even troubling to take proper aim. There was a savage roar and then a noise of crashing bushes. I was alarmed to see the animal rush growling towards me, and I fired a second bullet. The creature, terrifying, was hit and gave an incredibly swift leap and hid near the old Samormira. From behind this barricade, it gave threatening growls so fiercely that the tree to which I was clinging to seemed to shake. I had previously been on jaguar hunts and taken an active part in them, and I know how savage this cat is when it is run down and at bay, but the roars of the animal that attacked me that night were more terrible and deafening than a jaguar's. I loaded my gun again, and fearing another attack, fired in the direction of the roaring. The black shape roared again more loudly, but retreated and disappeared into the depths of the forest. From time to time, I could still hear its growl of pain until at last it ceased. End quote. Now, after his night spent in that tree, Inocencio ventured out and found broken shrubs, splashes of blood, and there was just this potent, sour-smelling stench in the area. Now again, like I mentioned earlier, while sightings have certainly begun to dwindle, fears that the Mapinguari may have recently gone extinct, they're put on the table. But it is kept in check because, again, as we discussed earlier, the far western parts of the Brazilian Amazon are untouched by man, hunters, and the developing world. So, do you think this is a real creature? A Bigfoot variant like the Didi of Guana or a Curupira? A thought to be extinct giant sloth species, perhaps? Or simply a cryptid in its own right? Some zoologists that have heard of this creature suggested it could simply be a spectacled bear, but it's worth noting that witnesses dismiss this immediately. Like, they look at this thing and they think, no, that's not what I saw. There is, of course, the upright giant anteaters. Definitely look at photos of those things too. They are huge. But with all that, well, we're going to close this episode out now. And I just want to thank you all for tuning in and listening in and getting to learn a little bit more about this cryptid. Reuben will be back next week. He was feeling a little under the weather, so he couldn't make it, but he says hello to all you wonderful people out there. And remember, you can find more content on our website at CryptidClues.ca, updates on our social media channels like Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, along with early ad-free episodes on our Patreon. And should you wish to reach us directly, you can via our email, cryptidclues@gmail.com. So until next time, everyone, remember, take care and stay safe.